everyone. Today I'm going to break down another pose and it's going to be downward facing dog. So pretty much every yoga class I've taken, at some point we do downward facing dog. It's one of those poses that looks easy but actually isn't. And in the body it can feel very challenging, and it's also a pose that's very difficult to teach. We often take it for granted that, well, it's just downward facing dog. It shows up all of the time. Most people know how to do it. But so many of us really struggle. So I'm going to break down this pose for you, give you some tips and tricks, and hopefully give you a little bit more relief in your downward facing dog. So the intention of downward facing dog, it decompresses the spine, but it's also an inversion. And you may think, well, an inversion, okay, that's a headstand, that's a handstand. No, an inversion is when your head and your heart are below your hips. So in downward facing dog, that's certainly the case. So let's go ahead and just get into our downward facing dog. I'm going to walk you through each part of it and give you some tips here. So when it comes to learning downward facing dog, I like to start always in a tabletop pose. Now you may say, I'm not always going to come into downward facing dog from tabletop, so how is this going to help me? Well, if you can practice downward facing dog in a really intentional pose like tabletop, right? You can really look at the alignment. When you approach the pose from other poses, maybe you're stepping back into a downward facing dog, or you're going through your vinyasa flow and you're pushing back into downward dog, not from a tabletop, you'll be able to feel in your body, right, that maybe I need to walk my hands forward a little bit, or my feet, or I need to do something different with my neck or my back. So this is just a great way to practice it and to really feel the downward facing dog. All right, so from our tabletop, we are stacking our hips over our knees, and we're going to take our hands and we're going to walk them forward just a couple inches. So our hands were under our shoulders and we're just going to walk them forward. Now we're going to take the hands and we're going to turn them, both hands, out so that we have an L shape with the fingers, with the thumb and the pointer finger. And what this does is it turns the elbow out. So the eye of the elbow, we call it, turns it out forward. So that just will give us a little bit more space and stability in our downward facing dog. All right, so we have our hands and our arms. Now with our feet, we want our feet to be hip distance apart. Now that's about 2 fists between our toes. We often think that our hips are much wider than they are. They're not that wide. So just think, okay, is it about 2 fists between my feet? Great. So we're gonna tuck the toes, and then we're gonna push back, pushing into the hands and lifting the hips up so we're in the upside down V. We let our head hang heavy, so the neck is long, so you don't want to be looking up, right? Just let it hang. And here we are in our downward facing dog. So there's a good distance between my hands and my feet. And one of the things we often see is that people will put too much weight in the hands or they'll put too much weight in the feet. So you want to think about balancing between the two. Now when you come to your downward facing dog, you can always walk your dog bending one knee and then the other. That's always an option for you in downward facing dog. It feels really good, especially if it's your first down dog of your practice, of your day. That's a great way to really come into the body. Now, another thing you can do is bend your knees a lot, okay? Now, this is something, just gonna come out of it for a minute so I can talk to you. This is something that I learned at an island yoga retreat, and it totally changed the way I looked at downward facing dog. Because I always thought, oh, my legs need to be straight, I need to, have that activation. bending the knees can really help with that spinal decompression. If you're struggling, if you're really having to like round your spine because it's just too much in your legs, if you bend the knees and you can come back a little bit and really get that spinal decompression here. So play with that. If your downward facing dog isn't feeling great, bend those knees, bend them as much as you need to. Now when it comes to the spine, coming back into our downward dog, we want to make sure that, our spine isn't rounded, so we talked about that, but we also want to make sure we don't go the other way. So I'm going to try to do this really exaggerated so that we're pushing so far that we're actually bending, we're doing like a back bend here, okay? We want to avoid that. And that's usually the case for people who are very flexible, they have a lot of space, and they can go into the pose just a little bit too deep. So if you're one of those people, just check in with your downward facing dog. Maybe even have someone else, a friend, take a look at it, and they can help you with your positioning, tell you what they're seeing, or even use a mirror. So that's downward facing dog. So a couple other things that I want to mention. We talked about bending the knees, but if you have any issues with your wrists, maybe a surgery or an injury, you can always come down to your forearms. I know some people who like to do that. So let me see if I can do this for you here. Okay, again, we're still getting that decompression of the spine, but we're not putting so much weight into those wrists. Instead, we're using the forearms. Another thing I want to mention is the heels. So a lot of times we think in our downward facing dog that our heels need to touch the ground. They do not, okay? Let go of that expectation. For most of us, that's not gonna happen, right? And again, it just has to do with how our body is put together. The goal of downward facing dog, again, is not getting those heels to the ground. It's that spinal decompression. All right, so just a quick recap. Practice your downward facing dog from a tabletop pose. Walk those fingertips forward. L shape with the hands, turning the eyes of the elbows forward. Feet hip width apart, tucking the toes, coming back into your downward facing dog. Always walking your dog. If you have a little bit of space to do that, bend the knees a lot if that feels good for you. Don't lift the neck up, just let it hang long. You always come down to your forearms if you have any wrist issues. Don't worry about your feet touching the mat, the heels. They may not get there, and that's okay. I think the most important thing to keep in mind with downward facing dog is to not worry about what the pose looks like. It's what it feels like in the body. So often we get concerned with, is this the perfect downward dog? There is no perfect downward dog. It's more, what is the perfect pose for you at this moment, right? So that may mean knees bent, that may mean coming down to your forearms, that may mean walking your dog a lot, and that may mean coming out of it sooner because your body's just had enough. So just honor that, listen to your body, just notice those different elements, and have some fun practicing. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned some things about your downward facing dog. And if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. If you like this video, if you like this content, give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and we'll be back next week. We'll break down another pose for you. Bye everyone.